Hi, this is Professor Raymond. I want to explain how to do some of the calculations that are involved in the first writing assignment for Bio 142 this semester. In this one, you need to pick a product that advertises in some way that it is low in fat. I'm going to use as an example this one here. It's a light sour cream made by Daisy, and it says on the side here that it's got 50% less fat. What I want to do is show you how to calculate exactly how many calories come from fat, and at the same time we'll calculate the percentage of calories from carbohydrate and from protein as well. This will give you a much better way of looking at the total fat content. Now, one of the things that you need to know in going into this is that carbohydrates and proteins have far fewer calories per gram than fat does. Fat has more than twice as many calories per gram. It is more calorie dense than carbohydrate or protein. And that's one of the reasons why I like to have students calculate the percentage of calories from carbohydrate, fat, and protein. If you just look at nutrition labels, what they will show you is the number of grams of carbohydrate, fat, and protein. Because these numbers tend to be fairly small and they're allowed to be rounded to the nearest even gram, they tend not to be as accurate as I would like. Then also, the grams, by looking in grams, you end up in many ways underestimating what the contribution of fat would be, whereas if you look in percentage of calories, you get a more realistic idea of the real energy value of that fat compared to the carbohydrate and protein. So when you make this calculation, the first thing you need to do is look at the nutrition label and find total fat here, 2.5 grams, total carbohydrate here, 2 grams, and the protein is 2 grams. So if I put that in my calculations here, starting off with 2 grams carbohydrate, 2.5 grams of fat, 2 grams of protein, the first thing we'll have to do is convert that into kilocalories. So what we have to do is multiply the grams of each one by the caloric density, the number of calories per gram of each one. This is going to give us the total number of kilocalories from each component. So that will give us 8.2 kilocalories of carbohydrate, 23.0 kilocalories of fat, and 8.6 kilocalories of protein. Notice how different it looks when you look at grams versus when you look at kilocalories. Kilocalories, the real measure of energy, makes it clear just how important fat is in contributing to the total number of calories. But what we want is a percentage. So we're going to have to add this up to get a total and then divide each individual one by that total. So our total kilocalories from this comes out to 39.8. Notice that on the label it told us 40, so with rounding error this puts us pretty close. If your number here comes out substantially different than your the total on your label, then you might want to double check and make sure you haven't messed up on your math. So that gives us 20.6% from carbohydrate, 57.8% from fat, and 21.6% from protein. Notice that these three add up to 100.0%. You'll want to add these up and double check, although your results might not come out to exactly 100.0. It should be within about 99.8 to 100.2, depending on how your rounding errors went. But if you're anywhere further off than that, you'll want to go back and check to make sure that you got your math right. Rather than just taking my word for these calculations, I would suggest that you go back in the film and get just the numbers and go through and do your own calculations. See if your calculations come out to be the same as mine, because you'll need to be able to do these calculations on your own for your own food item that you pick. Now, the next thing to do is to compare these numbers to the normal recommended values. So what are those normal recommended values? The USDA and the FDA recommended that people get 60 to 70% of their calories from carbohydrate, 20 to 30% from fat, and 10 to 15% from protein. And originally, they kind of pushed people to get toward the high end of the fat range, 70%, or of the carbohydrate range, 70%. The low end of the fat and the protein range, 20 and 10. A lot of people have since called these into question, consider this to be far too much in the form of carbohydrate, so you might notice that Spark People, for example, recommends generally that people get about 50% of their calories from carbohydrate. I get far less than that from my carbohydrate, far more from fat and protein. But since these are the general recommendations, this 20 to 30% is really the goal. This is that the FDA and the USDA recommended. And this is what the labels are all based on. So in order to call something low fat, it has to be below 30%, although since USDA and FDA are telling us that 20 to 30% is the normal that we're supposed to be aiming for, then more properly, low fat would be anything less than 20. Now notice that while this sour cream was labeled as being light and 50% less fat, it actually has the majority of its calories from fat, far more than the target range of 20 to 30% that's suggested by the USDA and FDA. So that means that even though this might have less fat than a normal sour cream, it is still a high-fat food item. So when you calculate these, you can tell, is this in fact high fat, or is it medium, normal fat, or is it low fat? And use this range 20 to 30 in order to make that comparison. Now something that's actually over 50% isn't just high fat, it's very high fat. But of course what we're talking about here is cream. Sour cream is of course high fat. That's what cream is. Cream is the fat that is taken off of the top of milk. There should be no surprise that it's high in fat. The problem is if people look at a high-fat food item and imagine that it's low-fat because of the advertising and then use it accordingly, they might end up overshooting the fat that they're aiming for. Or if someone's aiming for more fat, they might decide not to eat this because they don't think it has much fat, when in fact it really does. So one of the things that you need to analyze in each of these food items is it in fact low fat? And you'll figure that out by calculating the percentage of calories from fat and comparing it to this standard. But the other thing I want you to do is to calculate what contribution this particular food would make toward your total fat for the day. To do that, what you're going to have to do is calculate your personal fat quota. And let me show you how to do that. Okay, so here's how to do the fat quota calculation. Some of these things you're going to have to figure out for yourself. For example, your total kilocalories per day. I happen to know that mine is 3,000. The normal for males is 2,500. The normal for females is 2,000. If you are smaller than average, or if you are less active than average, you might need to be less than that. If you are larger or more active, or both, then you might have to have more. You might know from previous knowledge what your should be. You might have gotten this from the exercise in lab, but you're going to have to come up with a decision of what yours ought to be. So for mine, it's going to be 3,000. You also need to figure out the percentage of calories that you want to come from fat. Because I am aiming for a very high fat diet, I am going to aim for 65% of my calories from fat. Now this is much higher than the normal 20 to 30%. You might want yours to actually be within that 20 to 30% range. If you are using a low carb or ketogenic diet like I am, then you might have something in this range. Some people go even higher. It's up to you to figure out what yours should be, because this is your personal fat quota. Now, I want to take my 3,000 calories per day, multiply by 65%. So 3,000 times 0.65, right? That's 65%. And that means I'm looking for 1,950 kilocalories of fat each day. Now, the next thing to do, because kilocalories are difficult to track, labels are usually in grams, is to convert this number into grams of fat. We do that by dividing by the caloric density of fat, 9.2 kilocalories per gram. So I'm going to take this number, divide by 9.2, and it gives me 212. So the total grams of fat per day I'm going to have are 212 grams. Now, this is my fat quota. I'm looking for 212 grams of fat every day. How much is that sour cream going to contribute? If we go back and look at the serving size of 2 tablespoons, we find that 2 tablespoons gives me 2.5 grams of fat. So what I'm going to do is take that number of grams of fat per serving, 2.5, and I'm going to take my 212 and divide by 2.5. That's going to tell me how many servings of this sour cream I would need to fill my fat quota for the day. And I get 84.8. Right? That is the number of servings that I would need. Now, if I look at this label, it tells me that there are 15 servings per container. If I then divide this by 15, then it tells me that I need 5.65 and this is, there's a pound in each of these containers. So 5.65 containers of sour cream would fill my fat quota for the day. That is way more sour cream than I would ever eat. If I were trying to build up my fat, this lower fat type of sour cream would make it a lot harder for me to do so. I'd be better off with the higher fat sour cream, and even then I'd really have to get a lot of my fat from some other source because it's hard to eat that much sour cream. Now, if you had a much lower number of calories and a lower percentage that you were aiming for, and therefore a much lower total fat quota for the day, you might end up with a much lower number here. The point is, just because something is high in fat doesn't necessarily mean it's going to meaningfully contribute a lot of fat to your diet. It depends on how you eat it and how much of it you eat. And this fat quota calculation is designed to help you figure out how that item would fit into your diet. So, once you have calculated the percentage of calories from carbohydrate, fat, and protein, you're going to be able to describe whether it's high fat or not. Is the label correct in that matter? Then, by calculating the fat quota calculation here, how many servings would it take to fill your fat quota, you'll be able to figure out how eating this how far it would take you toward actually getting your fat for the day. Based on those things, and then also based on what you think of the taste of the actual item, then I want you to make a final conclusion about, is this an item that you're going to include in your diet on a regular basis? My conclusion on this is no. I want something with more fat, and frankly, I don't like the taste of this. I think sour cream, real heavy sour cream, tastes a lot better than this light crap. So I would never include that in my diet. But if you liked this sour cream and it fit well in your diet, you might have a different conclusion. So to review, do your calculations on fat quota and on percent of calories from fat, and make your conclusions. Tell me, is it a high-fat food item or low-fat or in between? How meaningful is the contribution in the way you actually eat it? And do you want to keep this food as part of your diet? So that's how to do this writing assignment. Having that done before you come into class would help keep you from falling behind because of this snow day. Thank you.